Good morning and welcome. I'm Frank Garman in the American Studies Department, and it's my pleasure to welcome you again to the Center for American Studies annual conference. This year's conference commemorates America 250, the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And we'd like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Jack Miller Center for their support. Our next speaker is Dr. Joseph Knippenberg, who will be speaking on the law of nature and nature's God in the Declaration. Dr. Knippenberg is professor of politics at Oglethorpe University, where he has taught courses on American government and political philosophy since 1985. He has won numerous teaching awards and received his BA from Michigan State University and his MA and PhD from the University of Toronto. Writing mostly about liberal political thought and liberal education, his writings have appeared in numerous edited volumes and journals, as well as on various websites. And he has previously served on the Georgia Advisory Committee for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the board of the American Academy for Liberal Education, and currently serves on the board of the Association for Core Texts and Courses. Welcome, Dr. Knippenberg.
It's with some trepidation that I stand here. Mark Hall is a very tough act to follow. I'd like to say he's forgotten more than I know, but that insults him by saying he's forgotten anything. But he knows a lot more than I know. Many years ago, at the invitation of my dear departed friend Peter Lawler, I presented a version of this talk, a very truncated version of this talk, at Berry College. Thanks to him and the efforts of many others, I've changed my mind somewhat. I say this because Professor Elizabeth Bush, when she made reference to Peter Lawler when she invited me to come to Christopher Newport University to speak. Now, this is not my first time at CAD, and I always look forward to it because my dear friend is a wonderful host. Her husband is a wonderful host. Her colleagues are wonderful hosts. So I'm glad to be here, and I thank Jack Miller and Jack Miller Center engaged as well. My topic is the laws of nature, nature's God, and the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to do a lot of throat clearing to get there. There was a time when I would have focused on and exaggerated the Lockean provenance of this phrase. Don't get me wrong. This language would roll trippingly off John Locke's tongue, and many other elements of the Declaration have their origins in the Second Treatise of Government. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. I could go on it much longer, but I don't want to try your patience too much. Section 220 of the Second Treatise, in the chapter of the Dissolution of Government, says this: when the government is dissolved, the people are at liberty to provide for themselves by erecting a new legislature differing from the other, whether changing persons or form or both, as they shall find it most for their safety and good. The Declaration says, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Another quote from Locke. But if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, and they cannot but feel what they lie under and see whither they are going, and so on. Declaration. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, etc., etc., etc. Many of my colleagues probably use Turnitin for student assignments, and Turnitin has a plagiarism checker and an AI checker now. I suspect that if I submitted Jefferson's draft for the final version of the Declaration to Turnitin, it would have told me there's a lot of overlap with Locke. I think that's true. Now, I don't want to claim that Locke is the sole inspiration of the Declaration. But at the same time, I think it's a mistake not to take Lockean thought into account and come to grips with it. And coming to grips in particular with what is meant by this phrase, the laws of nature and nature's God. My next contention is that the Lockean understanding of the laws of nature and nature's God looms larger for Thomas Jefferson than it does for others who contributed to the composition of the Declaration, not to mention those who signed it in Philadelphia and those who came to understand themselves as part of that people who assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them. In Jefferson's original draft, this passage, laws of nature and nature's God, constitutes the only explicit reference to God. In the final version, we all know very well, there are three others. While Jefferson, for example, affirms that all men are created equal and independent, and that from that equal creation are derived rights inherent and inalienable, the final version asserts that human beings are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. While creation might imply a Creator, the final version is explicit. The final version also, quoting here, appeals to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. And the final version also says that the signatories act with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. None of those references are in Jefferson's original rough draft. Now, I can't really improve upon my friend Paul Seaton's very concise summary of what happened. God, he says, is present in the Declaration. He is presented as creator, legislator, provident, and supreme judge. As scholarship has shown, the last two references were added to Jefferson's draft by the Continental Congress. They have the effect of beefing up the portrait of the divine. Providence is protected and can be relied upon. The supreme judge scrutinizes human activity the world over and penetrates to the intentions of agents. Considered together, human beings can take heart in the thought of superordinate protection as they engage in rightful action, while also knowing that they and it are subject to the most discerning gaze. Here I can foreshadow my conclusion by stating that the presentation of God in the final version of the Declaration is quite robust, even if not precisely Christian. Well, I'll say more about that later. For the moment, I'll leave it at this. Nothing about the Declaration's God taught is Trinitarian, nor does it imply or refer to Jesus as the Son of God. To be sure, there is an explicit reference to Christianity in Jefferson's draft, one that didn't, for obvious if unfortunate reasons, survive the final cut. In his list of complaints about King George III, we find this item. This is Jefferson's list. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. The Christian king of Great Britain. That's the only explicit reference to Christianity. Two things can be observed here. First, it was then, and remains now, a commonplace of secularist discourse to accuse Christians of hypocrisy or bad faith. That Jefferson is willing to hurl that accusation at King George III says nothing about Jefferson's personal faith. Second, the accusation does imply a conclusion about the moral and political content of what we might call genuine Christianity. For the accusation of hypocrisy to sting, Christians must be capable of feeling guilty about enslaving human beings. Whether true or not, Christianity properly understood must, so to speak, be on the side of the angels when it comes to slavery. That people of different faiths or no faith can make common cause on some issues, like the issue of slavery, is important for my argument. Now, let me turn to John Locke, to whom Jefferson and others among the founders owe some intellectual and philosophical debt. Now, I'm aware that there is an enormous controversy about Locke's relationship with traditional Christianity. People much smarter and more learned than I do have written volumes on the subject. I do take the view that it would strain credibility to regard Locke as a traditional Christian. Here are the considerations that lead me to this conclusion. Locke says, quote, that the state all men are naturally in is the state of nature. As Jean-Jacques Rousseau astutely observes in his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, and I'm quoting Rousseau here, it did not occur to most of our philosophers to doubt that the state of nature had existed, even though it was evident from reading the Holy Scriptures that the first man, having received enlightenment and precepts immediately from God, was not himself in that state. In other words, if you say the original state is the state of nature, you're saying the original state is not part of nature. Locke knows what he's talking about. Rousseau, no Christian himself, appropriately, he calls him out on that. In the second treatise also, Locke affirms two contradictory propositions. First, that men are the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, sent into the world by his order and about his business. And that's section 26. Section 27, anyone who's read Locke, remember this? Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. Locke's theory of property, which strikes me as the core of the teaching of the second treatise, hangs on this claim of self-ownership, which is inconsistent with the claim of divine ownership in section 6. A very coherent theory of human stewardship would follow from the section 6 proposition that we belong to God. But that theory of stewardship is most emphatically not Locke's theory of property. Also in chapter on property, Locke moves from an account of what God gave to mankind in time, section 24, to what nature gives human beings, which turns out not to be much. This is consistent with Locke's rather misleading citation of a passage from Paul's letter to Timothy. Check it out. It's 1 Timothy 6, 17 and 18, compared with Locke's misleading citation in section 31 of the second treatise, where Locke turns an exhortation to trust in the living God who gives us all things richly to enjoy, not in the uncertainty of riches. That's Paul. Locke turns this into an exhortation that human beings ought to work hard to transform the world to make it their commodious home. Don't rely on God, rely on your hard work. That's Locke. I can see that Locke quite frequently avails himself of religious language. Given his time and place, how could he not? But he makes use of this language as a vehicle to promote his own pride, making, for example, and here I'm quoting the letter concerning toleration, toleration the chief characteristical mark of the true church. That Christians may be called to be tolerant, and I think Professor Hall persuaded us of that, is beyond dispute. But to claim that toleration is the hallmark of Christianity is another matter altogether, or the true church. Might affirming the divinity of Jesus, by the way, Jefferson denies that, be more important, indeed the chief characteristical mark of, at least from a Christian point of view, the true church? Let this suffice for my argument that Locke's Christianity needs to be put into scare quotes. I return now to Jefferson, Locke's, in some ways, very faithful student. In his public position, articulated in the Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson sounds an awful lot like John Stuart Mill. Quoting Jefferson, "It is error alone which needs the support of government. Truth can stand by itself. Subject opinion to coercion, whom will you make your inquisitors? Fallible men governed by bad passions, by private as well as public reasons. And why subject it to coercion? To produce uniformity. But is uniformity of opinion desirable? No more than a face and stature. Introduce the bed of Procrustes, then, and as there is danger that the large men may beat the small, make us all of a size by locking the former and stretching the latter. Difference of opinion is advantageous in religion. The several sects perform the office of censor morum over each other. Is uniformity attainable? Millions of innocent men, women, and children, since the introduction of Christianity, have been burnt, tortured, fined, and imprisoned. Yet we advance not 1 inch would not advance 1 inch towards uniformity. What has been the effect of coercion? To make one half the world fools and the other half hypocrites, and so on. Reason and persuasion, he tells us, are the only practical instruments. To make way for these, free inquiry must be indulged. And how can we wish others to indulge it while we refuse it ourselves? The state, Jefferson avers, cares only for the public practical effects of religion. The legitimate powers of government, he tells us, extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does mean no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. He goes on to say that the examples of toleration in New York and Pennsylvania show how religion and its publicly beneficial effects can prosper under circumstances of toleration. They flourish infinitely, he says. Religion is well supported, of various kinds, but all good enough, all sufficient to preserve peace and order, and so on. They have made, he says, the happy discovery in Pennsylvania, for example, that the way to silence religious disputes is to take no notice of them. Privatized religion not only contributes to the public order, already contributes to the public order all that it can. Further, Jefferson's private opinions illuminate his estimation in the first instance of the role of reason. In a 1787 letter to Peter Carr, he says this: "Fix reason firmly in her seat and call to her tribunal every fact, every opinion. Question with boldness even the existence of a God. Because if there be one, he must more approve the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear. You will naturally examine first the religion of your own country. Read the Bible then as you would read Livy or Tacitus. The facts which are within the ordinary course of nature you will believe on the authority of the writer, as you do those of the same kind in Livy and Tacitus. The testimony of the writer weighs in their favor on one scale, and their not being against the laws of nature does not weigh against them. But those facts in the Bible which contradict the laws of nature must be examined with more care and under a variety of bases. Here you must recur to the pretensions of the writer to inspiration from God. Examine what evidence his pretensions are founded on, and whether that evidence is so strong that its falsehood would be more improbable than the change in the laws of nature in the case he relates. For example, in the book of Joshua, we are told the sun stood still for several hours. Were we to read that fact in Livy or Tacitus, we would class it with their showers of blood, speaking statues, beasts, etc. But it is said that the writer of the book is inspired. Examine, therefore, candidly what evidence there is of his having been inspired. On the other hand, you are astronomer enough to know how contrary it is to the law of nature that a body revolving on its axis, as the earth does, should have stopped. Should not by that sudden stoppage have prostrated animals, trees, buildings, and should after a certain time have resumed its revolution, and that without a second general prostration. Is this a rest of the earth's motion with the evidence which affirms it most within the law of probabilities? And then he turns to the New Testament and raises questions about the divinity of Jesus. Jefferson himself thought Jesus was the most exemplary human being, but he did not think of him as the Son of God. And he urges Peter Carr to use as guides books he lists in the appendix to his letter under the head of religion. And he mentions there Locke, Hume, and Voltaire. Not, for example, Luther, Calvin, Thomas Aquinas, or Locke's favorite, the judicious Hooker. He says, they will insist you in your inquiries to keep your reason firmly on watch and reading them all. Do not be frightened from this inquiry by fear of its consequences. If it ends in a belief that there is no God, you will find incitements to virtue and the comfort and pleasantness you feel in its exercise, and the love of others which it will procure you. Your own reason is the only oracle given you by heaven, and you are answerable not for the rightness, but the uprightness of the decision. Among other things, this letter to Peter Carr offers a gloss on the laws of nature, uses God as Jefferson understands them. For Jefferson, these laws are discernible by reason and science, i.e. by observation, and seem to preclude miracles, such as Jesus rising from the dead. If we were to treat Scripture the same way we treat Livy or Tacitus, that is, as books written by perhaps smart but certainly uninspired human beings, we must be led by a hermeneutic of suspicion regarding much of what is said in the Old and New Testament. Later on, much later on, in a letter written in 1822 to James Smith, Jefferson treats Unitarianism as the original truth of Christianity and expects that the present generation will see Unitarianism become the general religion of the United States. But he also asks his correspondents not to make his views public, lest they cost him unwanted trouble in his old age. He bears goodwill to all people of faith and people of no faith, for reasons that we have already seen, but isn't confident that his goodwill will be reciprocated. Traditional believers, Jefferson fears, may not be as tolerant as he is. For a picture of one sort of traditional believer, we can turn to the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, drafted in large part by John Adams. Like many of the early state constitutions, it begins with the Bill of Rights. Here are the second and third articles. Article 2. It is the right as well as the duty of all men in society publicly in the stated seasons to worship the Supreme Being, the great Creator and Preserver of the universe. The right as well as the duty. And no subject shall be hurt, molested, or restrained in his person, liberty, or estate for worshiping God in a manner and season most agreeable to the dictates of his own conscience, or for his religious profession or sentiments, provided he hath not disturbed the public peace or obstruct others in their religious worship. Now this is, as one friend of mine would say, using an old British expression, a bog standard statement of a kind of religious liberty. The right and duty to worship the Supreme Being. Article 3. As the happiness of a people and the good order and preservation of civil government essentially depend upon piety, religion, and morality, and as these cannot be generally diffused through a community, but by the institution of the public worship of God, and of the public instructions in piety, religion, and morality, therefore, to promote their happiness and to secure the good order and preservation of their government, the people of this Commonwealth have a right to invest their legislature with the power to authorize and require, and the legislature shall, from time to time, authorize and require the several towns, parishes, precincts, and other bodies politic or religious societies to make suitable provision at their own expense for the institution of the public worship of God and the support and maintenance of public Protestant teachers of piety, religion, and morality, in all cases where such provision shall not be made voluntarily. Continuing, and the people of this Commonwealth have also a right to, and do, invest their legislature with the authority to enjoin upon all the subjects and attendance upon the instructions of the public teachers aforesaid, at stated times and seasons, if there be any on whose instructions they can conscientiously and conveniently attend. If you have a preacher that you can listen to, you are required to attend worship services and listen to that preacher. Provided, notwithstanding, that the several towns, parishes, precincts, and other bodies politics or religious societies shall at all times have the exclusive right in electing their public teachers and contracting with them for their support and maintenance. And all the monies paid by the subject to the support of public worship and of public teachers aforesaid shall, if he require it, be uniformly applied to the support of the public teacher or teachers of his own religious sect or denomination, provided there be any on whose instructions he attends. Otherwise, it may be paid for the support of the teacher or teachers of the parish or precinct in which the said monies are raised. And every denomination of Christians, demeaning themselves peaceably and as good subjects of the Commonwealth, shall be equally under the protection of the law, and no subordination of any sect or denomination to another shall ever be established by law. Now, beyond noting the placement of these provisions near the head of the list of rights affirmed, let me make the following observations. The second article affirms, as I've already said, the right and duty of worship, as well as each individual's freedom to worship as he or she sees fit, provided he doth not disturb the public peace or obstruct others in religious worship. With the exception of the reference to duty, we should all recognize this as a fairly standard affirmation of religious liberty. The third article, in a sense, affirms what Jefferson affirms, that religion supports peace and order. But where Jefferson thinks that leaving people alone to organize their common religious lives as they please yields this result, Adams and his fellows call for a kind of religious establishment to accomplish this end. The Constitution says that the Massachusetts Constitution says that the legislature shall authorize and require that several towns, parishes, precincts, and other bodies politic or religious societies to make suitable provision for the support of these teachers. Where Jefferson seems to expect houses of worship to support themselves, Adams provides a backstop in the event that this support isn't forthcoming. The law can compel support, either by bodies politic or religious societies. In other words, a town can be required to support, say, the local congregational church, or the church can be compelled to support itself. The law can also compel everyone's attendance at worship, if, again, there be any on whose instructions they can conscientiously and conveniently attend. Each person can be required to support their own church, or the church supported by the town in which they live, if there's not one in particular they support. This is textbook, albeit plural, establishment of religion. Even though every denomination of Christians shall be equally under the protection of law, it's establishment plus freedom of the sort, if you're a Christian. The Massachusetts Constitution contains another typical element of establishment. No one is qualified to be governor of Massachusetts unless he shall declare himself to be of the Christian religion. There's a religious test for office holding in Massachusetts in 1780. While it's possible to argue that Jefferson and Massachusetts disagree merely about the means of the happiness of the people and the good order and preservation of civil government, the former, that is to say, Jefferson regarding tolerant religious pluralism as good enough, while the latter insisting upon the necessity of a broad and somewhat pluralistic Protestant establishment. But the Massachusetts Constitution also calls religion a duty, whereas the 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution, one of Jefferson's models of toleration, regards it simply as a right. Taken in this sense, religious worship is not merely a means to civil order, though it is that, but also, in some sense, an end in itself, worthy for its own sake because our Creator demands it of us. I end my brief excursion into comparative 18th century constitutionalism with one other observation. In the Pennsylvania Bill of Rights, the second article deals with religious liberty, while the 12th deals with freedom of speech. In the Massachusetts Bill of Rights, the second and third articles deal with religion, while liberty of the press is the subject of the 16th article. Religious considerations in both cases seem to be, so to speak, top of mind, while freedoms of speech and the press are considered separately and further down the table of rights. For those of us accustomed to thinking in terms of the First Amendment freedoms of religion, speech, and press, this is perhaps a little jarring. Both 18th century state constitutions and their federal counterpart address the leading concerns of a largely religious, mostly Protestant people. Religious freedom is, so to speak, the first freedom. But without going too far down this rabbit trail, I want to suggest that the First Amendment permits us to think of religion as both important for its own sake and as a kind of speech or viewpoint that deserves protection, even if we no longer take it as seriously as the statesmen and people of the 18th century did. As written, the First Amendment is either an insurance policy against secularism or an invitation to secularism, to treating religion as just another viewpoint. Now, as a practical friend of religious liberty, I'm perfectly happy to accept religion as a viewpoint protected for those reasons. And there is a Virginia case, Rosenberg v. Rector, which does just that. It was litigated by an old friend of mine, Michael McConnell. But the Pennsylvania and Massachusetts constitutions of the 18th century don't regard it as just another viewpoint. And I think if we regard it as another viewpoint, we could go down the path that Professor Hall perhaps cautioned us a little bit against. Now, I spent a lot of time laying the foundation for talking about the laws of nature and nature's God. Aristotle, in the Politics, says that one measure of the successful politeia, polity is often translated, which mixes elements of democracy and oligarchy, is that partisans of both bad regimes can recognize politeia as their own. Democrats will see the democratic element, oligarchs, the oligarchic elements. I think something like this is true of the line written by the rationalist Unitarian Jefferson and embraced by religious men and women of all stripes. For some, nature's God is the personal first mover who speaks to us only through our reason. Others will think of the Creator, the Apostle Paul describes in Romans 1:20, whose eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. Stated another way, all the religious language in the Declaration is inclusive, not exclusive. We all ought to be able to feel at home in a nation whose creed is expressed this expansively. I'll say a few more words about this in a moment, but first I want to invoke the shade of my dear friend Peter Lawler. In an important essay on John Gordon Murray, a leading American Roman Catholic theologian, Lawler explicates Murray's critique of the Lockeanism of many of the founding generation, as well as Murray's suggestion that in the end, they, that is to say, often Lockean founders, built better than they knew. Whatever the theory, which Murray and Lawler argue is ultimately, as they put it, nominalist, asserting the power of words and hence of human making over against a nature that in the end is chaotic and disorderly, but receptive to human making. As statesmen, Lawler and Murray say, the founders were led into a kind of realism as opposed to nominalism. Here I quote Lawler. Our Constitution, he says, presupposes that we are social religious beings open to the supra-political truth about God, and that capacity of our natures that leads inevitably to organized religion is meant to be an effective limit on the omnipotence and omnicompetence of the state. Our Constitution, through the compromises that produced the original religion clauses of the First Amendment, ended up being more Thomistic than our political founders knew. There is a kind of, Lawler and Murray argue, providential or accidental Thomism in the First Amendment. From the Constitution, Lawler turns to the Declaration, making much the same argument. Here again, I quote Lawler. The final draft of the Declaration ended up giving the God of nature all those traditional personal attributes. And that's because most of the members of Congress admired Jefferson's literary skill, but did not accept his philosophy. For them, Moses and Jesus were more important than the latest theoretical currents. Men who read and believed in the Bible had a decisive influence not only on the Declaration's character and content, but even on its philosophy. The Declaration, Lawler argues, was a compromise between the Puritans and the Lockeans, which is superior to either of its components, especially as philosophy. Most importantly, the compromise required the jettisoning of both the theocratic elements of Puritanism and the subjective privatism or nominalism of Locke's thought. We're left, as I've already said, with a kind of accidental or providential Thomism, identifying the God of nature with the God of the Bible, and affirming the limits of coercion in religion, as well as of the openness of the human person to the Creator God. We can see evidence of this in the early Pennsylvania Massachusetts Constitution, whose Bills of Rights, as I just showed, lead with freedom of religion. Having sketched the outlines of political theology implicit in the Declaration, I offer now a few concluding remarks. Above all, the nuanced position of the Declaration requires continued explanation and defense, much like we're attempting here. There are already constituencies on, loosely speaking, the right and the left are somewhat cruder readings of the Declaration, emphasizing either Christian nationalism or a largely secular version of the United States. I frankly think that at the moment, the latter constituency commands a lot more of our cultural and educational high ground. Jefferson's hopeful expectation about the ultimate dominance of a kind of moralistic theism, Unitarianism, was wrong for his time and remains wrong today, albeit for different reasons. What Lawler calls Lockean nominalism exerts a powerful influence, eroding the spiritual and moral foundations of our democratic republic. Now I'm going to appeal for a non-American source, the Canadian philosopher George Graham, to whose attention I recommend it to your attention. And I'm going to paraphrase very badly because I don't have the book in front of me. It's a book called English-Speaking Justice. Grant says of English-speaking justice, we've been spending down our inherited moral capital for quite some time. Some, like my old and perhaps former friend Patrick Knippenberg, argue that the only effective response is to reclothe what Richard John Newhouse once called the naked public square with a robust Christian, indeed Roman Catholic, garment. Our crisis, he thinks, urgently requires that extreme response. Oddly enough, Deneen's proposal bears a family resemblance to what President Barack Obama more than once described as building the kingdom of heaven on earth. To be sure, there's a difference between Obama's rather watered-down social gospel and the integralism that Deneen has embraced. I lack any sort of authority to call either one of those positions a heresy, but I don't believe that either effort would end well. I'm much more on board with the modest proposal that Deneen offered in Why Liberalism Failed, a book that I rather like. Our pluralism, articulated in the Declaration and embraced in the original understanding of religious liberty, permits the establishment, perhaps even the flourishing of communities of faith. Friends of freedom and limited government want to welcome various and diverse efforts to cultivate an understanding that there's something higher than the state or nation, and that respect for the dignity of the human person requires that we leave others free to find their own way to the truth. A truth that we might pray fervently that they come to acknowledge. If we take our own position seriously, we ought, as the signers of the Declaration did, firmly rely on the protection of divine providence. We ought to believe that the sovereignty of the people in the political sphere exists under God, but not in place of God. Thank you very much.
Okay, there should be some microphones coming. I'll obnoxiously take the first question as usual. So what I hear is not great to be imposing religion or taking this integralist position, and also not to be aggressively opposed to religion. I've also heard it said that our Constitution and our Declaration were written for a believing people, or a people that was primarily, at the time Christian, but primarily a believing people, not a secular, relativistic. And so my question is, do you A, agree with that point, and B, are we moving too far away from that right now, and is there anything to be done about that?
Well, I think you're right, and Professor Hall will remember the site better than I do. Was it William O. Douglas who said? What was the case?
I'm not sure the case that you get right.
Yeah, I mean, it was a 1950s case, and I think that's tolerably correct, and I think the assumption was, and I think that's the burden of George Grant's point, that the moral formation of citizens will still be largely left in the hands of houses of worship of various sorts. And as I said, I think that some people, especially the integralists, think that, how to put it, Providence needs some help. God needs some help, and God needs the help of the state. That is, as you pointed, again, Professor Hall pointed out, that's Constantinism. And I don't think that will end well. So what can we do? Well, I mean, I suppose I could quote, I think it's Crosby, Stills, and Nash, right? Teach your children well. They probably spoke better than they knew. But it does seem to me that as long as we defend and vigorously defend religious liberty, houses of worship and people of faith will flourish and take care of themselves. And if, in fact, and I will affirm this for my own sake, if in fact we're embracing in some sense the truth about the world and the truth about human nature, and everything else is relying on kind of just assertion of human will, a nominalism either of a Lockean or a postmodern sort. If I'm relying on the truth, I'm building on a much surer foundation than someone who is just speaking things into existence. God can speak things into existence. I can't. Human beings can't. And when they think somehow the words matter and they can create things, they're heresy, blasphemy, and all those other things, and it's going to fail. I suppose I could think of it in a couple of terms that are more or less literary. I will invoke J.R.R. Tolkien. There's the truth, and then there is an attempt to create on one's own a distorted truth, and that's Sauron. And if you want an American version of that, my son gave me for Christmas a novel by an author whose works I never thought I would read, and that's Stephen King. And I recommend to you The Stand, which King apparently thought was an American version of The Lord of the Rings. And guess what? Evil self-creation loses there too, even though it looks pretty bleak for a long time. I think that what you do if you're a person of faith is you live your faith, you make allies where you can to protect your faith, and that means, for example, you make allies not just with people who believe exactly what you believe, but people who also share your interest in protecting religious liberty, and in some cases, with people who are not people of faith. And again, I'll use another literary example here. Some of you might be familiar with C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength. One of the most interesting people in the circle at St. Anne's is a man named McPhee, who was raised in religion, but has become a kind of Humean skeptic. But he's skeptical enough to know that the attempt at remaking the world that the National Institute for Fortean Experiments, nice, not so nice, undertakes is wrong. So my allies don't have to be people I attend church with. They don't even have to be people of faith. They just have to be people who understand that there are limits to what human beings can accomplish, and the basis of their my alliance with them might be their skepticism in my faith. But I shouldn't have a religious test for political allies.
I think a number of people in the audience may not know what integralism is. Could you give a very pared down, simplistic, 2 to 3 sentence explanation of what that is?
It's a very recent effort that has long-standing roots that essentially the only way religion can thrive is if it's established, if it bears the sword. And the integralists in the U.S. now tend to be very traditionalist Roman Catholics. There were other efforts at this in the past. In my own particular tradition, there was a branch called theonomy. That was basically if the integralists want to restore essentially the Christian Roman Empire, the theonomists wanted to restore Calvin's Geneva. But in both cases, you have theocracy, you have compulsion of supported religion, compulsion of attendance, and religious deaths for office holding as things that you think the only way the country can be saved is if we make them all, now it seems we make them all Catholics, or we put Catholics in authority and everyone else becomes a second-class citizen.
Thank you.
Earlier in your talk, you said you didn't think that Locke was Jefferson's sole source for laws of nature and nature's God. Could you elaborate on who were others that you might believe influenced him, if they're not the authors of the fundamental books of public right that he references in his letter?
Well, I don't know that there were I don't think I said that there were other sources for Jefferson. I think that the other people believe that you could talk about the laws of nature, nature's God, without just believing that Locke is the source. I think for Jefferson, Locke was the principal source. For others, I think there's a kind of natural law talk that isn't exclusive to Roman Catholicism, and that you can find in some Anglican thought and some slightly less secularist continental jurisprudence of that time. So, getting out of my depth here, I would simply say, for Jefferson, Locke is one of the great sources, but I think there are people talking about the laws of nature that were not named John Locke, and in some cases, people whose embrace of some version or another of more or less traditional Christianity is also the case. And that's why I think, in some ways, if I'm a Jeffersonian rationalist, I can refer to the laws of nature, nature's God, and it means one thing to me. If I'm a neo-Thomist, I can refer to it, it means a somewhat different thing to me. If I'm a certain kind of Protestant, I can also embrace that language, and it means to me the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the proverbial clockmaker God or the first move, impersonal first mover. I do think it's language that people can regard as their own and interpret differently, and as long as as long as if I'm Jefferson, I don't think everyone agrees with me. Jefferson never would have. He kind of hoped everyone would agree with him, but he was wrong about that, and I'm glad he was wrong about that. But he would also, I think, welcome allies who were not on his page. And I think a great example of that is the effort to pass the Virginia Bill of Religious Liberty, where his consigliere, so to speak, was James Madison, who wrote the Memorial and Remonstrance. And who were the foot soldiers? Anyone know? They weren't Jeffersonians or Madisonians. They were Presbyterians and Baptists, who wouldn't have agreed with either Madison or Jefferson on a lot of other things. But on disestablishing the Anglican Church in Virginia, they're all on the same page. The Presbyterians were not so fastidious as not to welcome Jefferson and Madison into the coalition. And Madison and Jefferson weren't so fastidious as not to welcome the Presbyterians and Baptists into the coalition. And I think that's a good example for all of us, even if we don't necessarily share exactly the program. We can all find allies, make alliances for practical purposes, people with whom we have deep theoretical disagreements. And I think that's very good practical advice for all of us today.
Well, that's a good note to end on. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so please join me in thanking Dr. Knippenberg for his time.